I need to let everybody know that if you have questions, use the chat portions and ask them right away. And David, we're going to interrupt you with those questions and get them to you as fast as possible. So without any more blah blah from me, here's David Wall.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Tom. First of all, I want to just say appreciate Tom and Julie and for the work that they do and for the opportunity they've given me today to present this webinar. It's hopefully it's a topic that will be interesting and provide some new information for you. And as Tom said, feel free at any time to interrupt with questions if they come up, and I'll try to pay attention to my screen and make sure I get to those questions. Second, welcome to Salt Lake's a little bit. We had some snow earlier. I was hoping there would be some snow in the background for kind of some ambiance for us, but it stopped. But the ski places here in Utah are happy they're finally getting some snow. The topic of the webinar today is FAA owner trusts and current events, and kind of just wanted to go over the basics of trust and how they can facilitate primarily aircraft transactions and give information about those, and also talk about some of the current events surrounding trust and aircraft registration generally. First off, just as a general sense, I'm sure most of you have all dealt with trust at some level or another, whether that was a family trust for estate planning purposes or a charitable trust for charitable purposes. The FAA owner trust is a similar type of entity. It's a fiduciary trust arrangement that allows a trustee to act on behalf of a beneficiary to hold assets. With the FAA owner trust, of course, you're specifically holding an aircraft, a helicopter, fixed wing airplane, and in some cases, actually, in some structured cases that we'll talk about a little bit later, the trust also holds funds to facilitate the transaction. It can also do that. The trusts created by FAA owner trust are what we call revocable grantor trusts. This means that the grantor of the trust is also the beneficiary, and that it can be revoked at any time. It's up to the grantor's will when it's terminated. It requests from the trustee termination at any time. It's not, some of your charitable trusts can be irrevocable. This one is a revocable trust. And I just got the first question of the day is, I thought trusts were only for foreign owners to register aircraft in the U.S. That's partially true, and it is probably the primary purpose. Probably about 70% of the trusts that we do are for foreign owners. But as we go into a few more slides, you'll see that some entities that may think they're U.S. owners may actually not be, may not qualify. And also, sometimes U.S. owners need to use them to help facilitate a transaction one way or another. This last bullet point, these type of grantor trusts are, for tax purposes, are treated as pass-through. So essentially, what that means is, a lot of people, the question we get most often is, how can this trust help me avoid taxes or do something along those lines? And the trust, these type of trusts aren't really for those purposes. It's a pass-through trust, so any sales tax, use tax that would otherwise be levied against you for the aircraft, or tax benefits for that matter, pass through to the grantor entity. So the entity that's the grantor / beneficiary of the trust. So it doesn't, help avoid the sales tax in any way. You can't avoid your California use tax, but they're it simply passes through. But there are some situations in which the trust can help facilitate some tax planning, certainly. Let me move on to the next slide here. And this kind of goes to that question that was just offered a few minutes ago. What are the reasons for an FAA owner trust? And the first one up here is a non-U.S. citizen trust. So they're used for non-U.S. citizens to be able to register trust. We'll go into these different things in a little bit more detail. The second one is, as I mentioned, a lot of times they're used to help facilitate transactions. So there's a lot that are used as either export or import, kind of what we'd call flyaway trust, a short-term trust, to help facilitate kind of a cross-border transaction. The third bullet point is debt structuring. In some complex debt structures, a trust is used to help facilitate the debt financing and also to syndicate the debt in some situations. A lot of those are more based around commercial lending than you would find on like a business aviation or corporate aviation transaction. The fourth bullet point is privacy enhancement. There's a number of U.S. citizens or corporations that, especially in recent years, have used trusts more and more to help provide a bit more privacy related to the ownership of the aircraft, just so that everyone wouldn't know it's them flying around, so that information was maybe a bit more difficult to find for people who are looking for that information on where their competitors might be flying, where famous people might be flying. We've had some situations where had some stars put their aircraft into trust just so it wasn't easily available where they were traveling. So going into the non-citizen trust a little bit, and the difference between the trusts, they're all very similar. There are minor differences between trust for citizens compared to non-citizens, but the basic structure is the same, and we'll go into that a little bit later. The FAA, of course, in the FAA regulations requires that all entities registering aircraft have to meet U.S. citizenship requirements. It surprises a lot of people to find out that if I create a Delaware LLC, if I'm a foreign citizen, create a Delaware LLC, that doesn't count as a U.S. citizen for FAA purposes. Likewise, there's some rules that actually may kick out corporations that we might normally would think would be U.S. citizens, but because of some of the requirements of the FAA, that may kick them out. Here's, just as a brief item, an individual has to be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, so they have to have their green card. One interesting note with that is if you work with a fractional provider, if you own or have a client that has a aircraft with a fractional provider, often, even if that individual who wants to purchase a fractional interest is a green card holder or a permanent resident, the fractional provider will be reluctant to register in their name and will ask for a trust, just because those green cards can be taken away quickly, and the fractional provider doesn't want to risk the registration of the aircraft if that individual was to lose their permanent resident status in some way. The next point, U.S. corporations with the president and 2/3 of the boards are citizens, and 75% of the voting stock is U.S. citizens. So back to the point that there are companies that many of us would think are U.S. citizens that actually put their aircraft into trust because of some of these rules. We've had corporations who hired a British citizen as its president or CEO and had to put their aircraft in trust. We've had other situations where they've had a major stock purchased by foreign entities or citizens, and because of that, they feel uncomfortable with their levels of stock ownership might lie a lot with foreign ownership, and they're getting close to perhaps that 75%, and they don't want to risk any corporate aircraft possibly having registration issues if they go over. So there's companies, perhaps like Coca-Cola, that we typically think of as a U.S. company that put their aircraft into trust in order to maintain that registration, not have to worry about the voting stock and things like that. LLCs are treated very much like corporations. As I mentioned, some foreign citizens believe, well, I'll just create a Delaware LLC and then I'll be able to register my aircraft with the FAA. That's not true. Again, if the members, if the manager is not a citizen, or if 2/3 of the members aren't U.S. citizens, you can't register the aircraft in the name of the LLC. This last item is partnerships. All partners have to be individual U.S. citizens. This actually comes into play a lot. We see this a lot with certain states where limited partnerships are for tax reasons are popular. You'll see that you'll have a limited partnership that is owned by a corporation, that the partners are corporations. The FAA does not allow the partners to be corporations. If you have a partnership, it has to be individual U.S. citizens. So even if you have a company that would qualify as a U.S. citizen, if it's a partner of a partnership, it cannot register the aircraft. So, for example, in the state of Texas, where we often see limited partnerships for tax planning, corporate tax planning purposes, they'll often have corporations be the partners, and they cannot register the aircraft because those corporations are partners. They're not individual U.S. citizens. So they will put the aircraft into trust to avoid the registration issue. And as I said, owner trusts solve a lot of these issues. For non-citizens, you know, everyone can understand the non-citizen, but also for potential, what we would consider citizens otherwise, but maybe do not meet these regulatory requirements. It solves those type of issues. So the next slide is, why would the next big question, and many of you may understand this and know why, but why would a non-citizen, why would a foreign citizen want to register an aircraft with the FAA? The main point is just that the FAA has the largest market of the U.S. is the largest aviation market in the world by a large degree, and so you have a lot of transactions taking place here in the U.S., a lot of what we call cross-border transactions. As I put on here, as we just discussed, they can't meet the technical requirements of the FAA citizenship rules. The next one is import-export. So in a lot of situations, we have a foreign purchaser buying an aircraft here in the U.S. Of course, as soon as the aircraft is purchased, you have to, change the registration. But as the foreign purchaser, they cannot register the aircraft in the U.S. So a lot of times they'll turn to a short-term kind of trust where they'll put it in trust until they can export it to the country of where they're going. If they're a German purchaser, they'll put it in trust for short-term until they can fly it over to Germany. Export the aircraft, fly it over to Germany, deregister it with the FAA, and then they can register with the German CAA. The third point, we have a lot of clients who simply spend a lot of their time, or even a majority of their time, flying in the U.S. A lot of Canadian clients, a lot of Mexican clients who end up, because of their business needs, end up flying a lot in the U.S., a large percentage, and feel more comfortable having FAA registration for the aircraft. This fourth point, we work with a number of lessors who put their aircraft into trust because they lease to U.S. operators who want it FAA registered. They have FAA pilots. They want the aircraft FAA registered. And so we have Irish lessors, Irish leasing companies, Canadian lessors, leasing helicopters into the U.S. or to U.S. operators. And if those are traditional dry lease, they're not finance lease transactions, the aircraft have to be registered in the name of the owner, so the lessor will establish a trust in order to be able to register it on the FAA and lease it to their U.S. operator. This final bullet point is the registry. aircraft registry in the country of the person is suspect, and this can be for many reasons. We have a number of aircraft that are based in African countries, a lot of times even operated by U.S. entities, but they spend a lot of time in African countries and they're uncomfortable with the registration of the country that they're primarily based in. Or we've had different situations where you have governmental strife that may cause a person to be concerned about their country of registration. For example, over the past 15 years, Venezuela, there's been a lot of concern there. Here's a question, another question from the audience. Do trusts provide any liability protection in the event of a disaster? Another thing with the trust, similar to the tax question, is they don't provide any coverage or liability for the operator. Traditionally, with aircraft, you have the operator in charge of liability of flying the aircraft, and of course, there have been some recent cases where owners have also been included in that. The trust doesn't provide any liability coverage for that. We still depend on insurance of the operators like everyone else, and in fact, in our when we explain the kind of structure that these transactions take, we also in our operating lease agreements or any lease agreement, we require that the trustee and trust are included as additional insureds on any insurance coverage, because it doesn't really provide any type of shielding to the owner or the operator. They're still responsible for that end. Going a little bit more into the export or import trust, as I mentioned, they're short-term trusts to help facilitate the purchase or sale of an aircraft to international buyers or sellers. Another common one that we see, I discussed kind of the export trust where a foreign purchaser will buy an aircraft in the U.S. Another popular one that we see fairly often are aircraft that are being imported. So you have a aircraft owner in Russia who decide that they can't, the best way to get value for the aircraft on the sale of their aircraft is to open it up to a larger market. If it's Russian registered, you might have buyers a little weary of that, a little concerned about how the maintenance has been, if it can pass certain flight standards and safety standards. So we'll have Russian sellers who will import the aircraft on the FAA, make sure they can get their FAA certificate of airworthiness, and then it essentially opens up their aircraft to a larger market. And again, typically these are short term. They'll bring it in, get its certificate of airworthiness on the FAA, and then start opening up for market the aircraft for sale. And usually the hope is that they sell that in a short period of time. On the export ones, maybe one more topic to discuss. You have the foreign purchasers coming into the U.S. and purchasing the aircraft. One of the issues that we see fairly often is foreign purchasers buying a U.S. aircraft and then leaving it in the name of the buyer while they export the aircraft. Having a bill of sale but not filing it, even dating the bill of sale but not filing it. Or another issue is the foreign purchaser putting it with a ferry flight company, putting the title with the ferry flight company. There's a number of legal concerns and issues that arise with that. First of all, the fact that if you put it in title with your ferry flight company, the ferry flight company, for all intents and purposes, is the owner of that aircraft. On the FAA, they're registered. You might really like your ferry flight company. He might be a really nice guy, but during the term when he's bringing that over, he's the registered owner. And if something were to, what you know, for example, if your ferry flight company went into bankruptcy suddenly, that is his asset at that time, and you know, that could be by his lenders. That asset could be reached by him. Another issue is just simply that the FAA has taken an interest in these lately and has tried to enforce the fact that once an aircraft sells, it should be in the name of the new purchaser. A number of times we've had ferry flight companies call us up and say, yeah, the FAA realizes we're not the real owner of the aircraft. Right now, we were just doing it for this company, for this foreign XYZ company, but we're not the real owner, so we're going to have to put in trust. And the trust is able to solve this because the beneficiary of the trust can be the foreign entity. And so through the trust, they have their ownership. One question, and we can get into this a little bit later, in fact, when we discuss a little bit more privacy trust, is the FAA, does the FAA keep a copy of the trust, and is it available for public viewing? It is. The trust has to be submitted with FAA documents, and it is a public document that can be requested. So we can go into a little more detail that in a few slides when we talk about how there can be some privacy enhancement with trust, but the trust is a public document. So my recommendation for these, when you have a foreign purchaser, my recommendation is to put it in a trust because it relieves a lot of that liability of having it temporarily with the ferry flight company, which isn't technically the registration you're supposed to have if there was an event, a crash or some type of event like that. The insurance could bring up the fact that you know, the ferry flight company wasn't the real entity. You might go back and say, well, we had this bill of sale dated that shows this foreign purchaser is the real owner, and that could cause problems with the FAA, since you're supposed to, as soon as the aircraft is sold, you're supposed to register that interest with the FAA. We actually did have a situation, one more similar type situation. We had a customer who approached us because it was a foreign owner, but he had a son who was a permanent resident in the U.S., and he decided to just allow the son to own the aircraft, register the aircraft with the FAA. Things were going fine until the father and the son got into a family argument over finances, I believe, and as it turns out, the son decided to sell the aircraft without the father's permission. The father had paid for the aircraft. For all intents and purposes, it was the father's aircraft, but the son went ahead and sold it because on the FAA registry, the son is the owner. He's not limited by the ownership, what the father says his ownership is. He's 100% the owner, and the son was able to sell the aircraft and get the proceeds from the aircraft as the owner. So kind of another tale of warning of how, you know, just saying, well, we'll have this person hold our aircraft, or we'll have the seller hold the aircraft while we ferry it, or we'll have a ferry flight company hold the aircraft while we ferry it over. There can be some large risks with that. The next reason for FAA trust is debt structuring. Trust can be used on commercial levels. Typically, trusts are used to syndicate debt. The trustee can be used to facilitate loan payments to various lenders based on waterfall payments, those kind of things. And also, we have seen some lenders, U.S.-based lenders, prefer trust in some scenarios, even on business aircraft. We've had a number of Mexican clients who have U.S. business as well, get a loan through their U.S. Lending relationship, but because the U.S. lender would like to have the aircraft remain on the FAA registry, and therefore the solution was to put it in a trust to allow it to remain on the FAA registry, and also give the U.S. lender a little bit of comfort that if it ever came time to repossess that aircraft, it might be slightly easier to get in contact with the trustee. A lot of times lenders will put in type of powers of attorney over the beneficial ownership of the aircraft. If there is some type of default in the lending arrangement, they can go ahead and assert their right to become the beneficiary of the trust. The final reason here is privacy enhancement. So going back to the question that we had a little bit about ago about trust being filed with the FAA. As many people are aware, I'm sure, any tail number is easily accessible on the FAA's website to see who the owner, their address is. And in addition, you can then go to various flight tracking sites and perhaps even see where that aircraft is flown. The trust does allow additional layer of privacy. The aircraft, if you knew a tail number of an aircraft, November 99 Sierra Bravo, if you search that immediately, you could see either that it's XYZ company with such and such address, or you could see if it's in a trust, it does just show up as under the trustee's name. So it's a TVPX Aircraft Solutions as trustee and list our address. So there are a number of U.S. owners who recently have used trust to help provide an additional layer of privacy. Also for a competitive advantage if you're worried about merger and acquisition or corporate espionage, where people might be trying to see where your executives are flying. We see that in that type of scenarios, and it does provide, even the basic owner trust provides a little bit extra privacy. We compare it to an onion. So if you have the ownership of the trust, if it's in a trust now, as somebody on the call pointed out, those documents, the trust documents, are filed with the FAA and are publicly available. So someone could request those documents, but of course that would take a little more know-how than your just generally interested person. The other thing that has been increased concern related to privacy is the new ADS-B rules. Of course, people can be part of the BAR program, the MBAA's BAR program for flight tracking services, but there are other websites that will track the ADS-B, and unlike FlightAware and some other reputable flight tracking services, they may not follow the BAR rules, the FAA rules as far as that's concerned, and may track your aircraft more than you feel comfortable with. Another possibility is we have a product that allows multiple layers of trust that provides additional privacy, kind of additional layers to that onion, if you will. And oftentimes the initial layer of the trust is filed with the FAA, but subsequent layers may not be. So there are options to do additional layers of trust, do multiple trusts to help provide additional privacy for the aircraft. Now, the caveat, of course, to these kind of increased privacy trusts is that it's not private from the FAA or regulators. We still have to comply with information to FAA people, to tax people, other governmental entities that want to know the ownership. And the second caveat is that if you have your name on the side of the aircraft or are taking selfies and posting them on Instagram with your aircraft, that's not going to help the attempt to keep some of your aircraft use private. So as I mentioned, it's an onion with layers, but it's something that can provide additional privacy to clients or owners who are concerned with that. This next slide just kind of shows the typical basic trust structure. You have the beneficiary or grantor at the top. Typically, as we mentioned, a lot of these are foreign entities or U.S. entities. you have a trust agreement with the trustee that kind of establishes the relationship between the beneficiary and the owner trustee. The FAA does have a lot of requirements. The trust agreement isn't exactly what you'd see on a normal type of U.S. common law trust if you were doing one for your family. There are requirements by the FAA that a trust have that is registered with the FAA. There are requirements related to operation of the aircraft that the trustee has some level of independence. If the FAA came to the trustee with a matter of national emergency or something along those lines, that has never occurred, but there are those stipulations in the trust agreement that you wouldn't see in a normal type of trust agreement. Then there typically is a lease agreement. This oftentimes, if it's with either back to the beneficiary of the trust or one of their nominees, one of their sister companies, we typically call this an operating lease agreement. It's typically not doesn't have funds exchange hands. It just allows operational control. Go back to the grantor or their nominee. If the grantor is XYZ company, many times they'll have their sister company, ABC company, be the operator of the aircraft. So that's common. In scenarios where you have where you're leasing to a third-party lessee, this is more of a typical type lease agreement. And in the lease agreement, you can have the funds either go directly to the grantor or they can flow through the trust agreement and go to the trustor that way, depending on structure. And if you have various needs in some states, of course, there's a benefit to paying taxes based on the lease of the aircraft as opposed to paying sales tax. So in some situations, the trustee can actually help facilitate tax payments on lease taxes in some jurisdictions. So that might be an opportunity where a trust could help facilitate more than just the ownership, but actually help facilitate some of those lease payments or tax payments on lease taxes. One of the questions that we're often asked is, can you have lending in a trust structure? People are worried about lending, how their bank will react if they say, well, it's not going to be owned by me, it's going to be owned by a trustee. And the lending is easily incorporated into a trust structure. Most aviation lenders are familiar with owner trusts and how they work. We've worked with most of the major banks, even banks that don't typically lend on aviation. We've worked with them and been able to get them through the process. Different lenders will have different requirements. Some will have the trustee act as both the borrower and the mortgagor on the security agreement that's filed with the FAA. Others will have a separate loan agreement with the actual borrower, with the grantor of the trust, and then just simply have a mortgage and security agreement filed with the FAA with the trustee. So some lenders have different structures of documents that they use, but they can certainly, we've certainly worked with every lender that I can think of. Another item is trust can actually help facilitate finance leases or lease purchase options on the FAA. Of course, if there is a lease with a purchase option, or typically called a synthetic or finance lease, the lessee can become has that ownership interest, so is actually the registered owner. So in some scenarios where you have a lessee under a finance or a synthetic lease, if that lessee does not meet the citizenship requirements of the FAA, the trust can actually step in as what we call a lessee trustee and facilitate that ownership through the synthetic lease and then sublease to the beneficiaries and operator. So this next slide is alternatives to an owner trust for non-citizens. Probably Many people are probably wondering, wait, this guy just gave me a whole spiel about how owner trusts are great and I can use them, and now he's going to tell me how there's alternatives. So I will tell you there's alternatives, but as you'll see when we go through them, they're limited. The main alternative to a owner trust for a non-citizen, for an entity that won't qualify as a citizen, is the base and primarily used. It's the FAA regulations 47.9. Some people call it BAPU for short. It says that if an aircraft is based and primarily used in the U.S., if 60% of the flight hours are U.S. to U.S. locations, a U.S. corporation that's not a U.S. citizen, doesn't qualify as a U.S. citizen, can register the aircraft. Now the limitations on that are kind of severe, and you'll be able to see why in this type of situations a lot of companies end up using trust anyway. The first kind of limitation on that is the aircraft has to be registered to U.S. corporation. So it has to be your Delaware Inc. It has to be XYZ Inc. incorporated in Delaware. It can't be a foreign entity. It can't be an LLC. It can't be a partnership. It can't be an individual. It has to be a U.S. Established corporation. So for a lot of entities, when they're looking at a foreign entity, when they're looking at the possibility of having an aircraft that they know is going to be based in the U.S. and primarily used in the U.S., they'll often look at this, but then as you're weighing the fees or costs incurred with setting up a U.S. corporation, possibly having to worry about tax concerns in the U.S., oftentimes it's cheaper and easier to just simply have an owner trust where the beneficiary of an owner trust can be a foreign entity. So you don't have to set up a Delaware LLC or Delaware corporation. It can be your Maldives corporation. It can be your Bermuda limited company. So a lot of times when they look at the fees and possible tax implications associated with setting up a U.S. corporation, they'll know that it might be easier just to set up a trust. Secondly, the flight hours, 60% of the flight hours have to be to a U.S. location. So a lot of entities who have corporations that have large aircraft that fly transatlantic, trans-Pacific a lot might not meet that requirement. The final thing is this final bullet point, the time, every 6 months you have to file a time report with the FAA that outlines your hours used. So a lot of times this will also kick out companies who think, well, this might be easier, but in the end, when they consider, well, every 6 months I'm going to have to file a compliance certificate with the FAA that shows my flight hours, a lot of entities will determine, no, it's easier just to put in a trust that doesn't have that type of filing requirement. So there is that possibility of based and primarily used, but as you can see, it's fairly limited to particular circumstances, and even within those circumstances, either the cost of it or possibly having to file that report every month will again say, it might be easier to just use an owner trust. The second bullet point is voting trust, which is something we do as well, and it's very related to an owner trust. It's actually a trust where instead of holding the aircraft, the trustee holds the ownership or membership in an LLC, the ownership of a company, the stock of a company, or the membership of a company to allow it to qualify as a citizen. So then XYZ LLC can register the aircraft itself because the membership of that LLC is put into a trust. So it's a similar type of structure for a non-citizen, but of course not exactly the same. Just want to go in a few minutes on current events with trusts. I rambled on more than I thought I would, so we'll try to go over this quickly. Some news about trusts and also some proposed FAA legislation that could impact trusts, but also impacts registration of aircraft generally. Many of you know in 2011, the FAA actually put a moratorium on owner trust for about a week. That didn't last long as the aviation industry kind of rallied to show the importance of trust, how they help facilitate transactions, and that there's no in many of these transactions, there's no other alternative. You have big in the aviation industry giants like GE, Boeing, Cessna at the time, Textron, Gulfstream, stepping up and kind of clarifying to the FAA the importance of these trusts, and also a lot of the FAA registration people echoing that as well. The moratorium was actually placed for about 2 weeks and then released, and the FAA decided, well, we're gonna, instead of, we understand the importance of trust, so we're gonna add some additional rules. So in 2013, the FAA had a policy clarification on FAA owner trust. Many of you may have heard about that. They placed more burdens on the trustee. Their primary issue with trust in the first place was they were worried about safety. Some trustees had been difficult to get information on the operations from. So the FAA established some new guidelines. They have what's called the 2 and 5 day rule, where the trustee has to respond to inquiries from the FAA within certain time periods. Those inquiries range from where the aircraft is based, where the records are kept, and then for 5 days, who are the actual pilots on X date, and reviewing the actual maintenance logs and records within 5 days. So it has required, it's something that reputable trustees were doing already. They were facilitating this process already, but there were some trustees who perhaps were not as easy to deal with for the FAA, and so they established these rules to make sure they could comply with safety, make sure that they could get information from the operators as necessary. Kind of current events. Many of you may have seen this headline in the New York Times not long ago from Utah: secretive help for a Russian oligarch and his jet. It actually touched on owner trust a little bit. It got a lot of the information wrong. There was also a Boston Globe Spotlight article late in 2017 about registration of aircraft, and touched on trust a little bit. Again, it kind of misconstrued what trusts are used for a little bit, which is somewhat typical of the media in some situations, and simply not digging in to know the real reasons on why a trust was used in this particular situation. It is an ongoing concern for the trust industry because there is no limitation. There are some trustees not as reputable. You have reputable providers like TVPX and Bank of Utah and Wilmington Trust, and then you have some providers who are operating out of their house, are perhaps difficult for the FAA to deal with, or other entities to get information, other governmental entities to get information from. One of the issues with the news articles was, the basis of how much information they should know about the ownership of the aircraft. And the articles actually went into that generally on registration, that the ownership of an aircraft, the FAA only has the most basic information on the ownership of the aircraft. They don't, if XYZ LLC, Delaware LLC registers an aircraft and says that they're a U.S. citizen, the FAA takes that at face value and registers the aircraft. With trusts, actually there is more looking into the owners of the aircraft than with many regularly registered aircraft, as reputable trustees do look at background information, due diligence, know your customer information on all their customers that go into trust. We have a robust program that we look at every trust, every beneficiary of trust, make sure there aren't any limitations to us doing business with them. And so, as the articles didn't point out, actually in some situations more people are looking into who the beneficiaries are of this trust than a regular registration. Mentioned on this next slide kind of goes into a little more depth. The aircraft, one of the questions that the articles seemed to highlight was that aircraft in trust are more dangerous than other aircraft, and that just simply isn't true. Now there are bad actors in all industries, and sometimes there are bad actors in aviation. The trustees try to do their best job as possible to go over the due diligence for all these beneficiaries. And as I mentioned, there's more people reviewing and looking at these entities that are putting aircraft in the trust than just regular registration oftentimes. So I don't think there's any basis to say that there is extra concern for aircraft that are in trust. There is some, as a result of some of these articles, there was some proposed legislation by Congressman Lynch in Massachusetts about beneficial ownership of all FAA registration. This would require that all registrations submitted with the FAA, whether U.S. citizen, private, commercial, all registration would have to show who the ultimate ownership of the aircraft is. So if I went and registered my XYZ LLC with the FAA, I'd have to provide the information on the ultimate owners to the FAA. The FAA would have to review that information. Now, the issues with that, and I'm not necessarily for or against that type of legislation, just the fact, because as I mentioned, we actually do this type of background search on all trusts. But of course, to make the FAA do this, they would have to increase staffing and funding. There would be questions on who would manage the rejections and who would manage the decisions on aircraft if they'd be rejected. And also a timing issue. One of the benefits of the FAA is it is, as far as government entities go, it works smoothly, and a lot, especially the registration branch, it's done quickly, which benefits the industry. And so, you know, we could, if legislation like this went through, we could see a timing issue that may possibly hurt the industry. Another thing that we're looking at is how the industry can help. TVPX and other reputable trustees, as I mentioned, have a due diligence process, and we're trying to help the industry and see how we can help the FAA possibly in providing background searches for these people, and see how we can help the FAA rather than having a possible a government solution to the problem, possibly have an industry helped solution to making sure that aircraft are registered to people who you want them registered to, make sure they try to get as many bad actors out as possible. That's my prepared presentation. Hopefully it gave you basic information on what they're used for. Any additional questions that may have came up in your mind, certainly be willing to answer those now, or I've provided my contact details if you have something come up later or a specific situation come up, I'd be happy to answer those.
Dave, this is Tom Alston. I want to thank you for the presentation. I think that I learned things about trust that I had absolutely no idea. And I can tell you that while we were calling people to inform them of this, well, what does that mean? So anybody who says, what does that mean? Obviously, they should have watched this video, right? They should have watched this webinar. Well, we recorded it for them, so they're going to get to see this for you. It's going to be up on our website quickly. And we got a question coming in. Can you address basic probate? It looks like then after that there's a hyphen that says trust benefit question mark. Question mark.
Yeah, there is some benefits to a trust. We have had some people put aircraft either with a possibly an elderly owner where they wanted to have the aircraft in trust. They've often, primarily where it's concerned with the registration, the chief concern is that once the older owner, the patriarch of the family dies, how will the aircraft remain registered? how quickly, will it have to sit on the ground while we go through probate? And one of the benefits of the trust registration is that, if that owner was to put it in trust with either himself as the beneficiary or with family as co-beneficiaries, the aircraft there wouldn't be any concern about, do we have to keep the aircraft on the ground? Does it remain registered even though it's in our elder patriarch's name and he's now passed away? The trust would be able to keep it registered. You'd be able to keep operating the aircraft until probate went through for other items. So it can be used. It isn't used solely as a estate planning tool, but it can be used to help facilitate the continued operation of the aircraft during a probate type scenario. So we have had it in scenarios where you had a elderly patriarch or matriarch of a family who will own the aircraft individually in their name, put it into a trust to help facilitate that.
Thank you for answering that. We've got like maybe 2 more minutes before I want to cut this off. So if anybody else has any questions, please send them in right away while Dave is available. If you think of them later, David's phone number is on the screen. If I was you, I'd take 30 seconds and take your phone out and take a picture of that, because we just got another question. How does FAA owner track work with LLC? Which owns which? Does owner trustee own or manage the LLC? Is LLC donor donee? Were you able to follow me on that, Dave?
Yeah, great question. I think hopefully I can answer that. Typically with the owner trust, the LLC is the trustor, the beneficiary and grantor of the trust. The trustee, the trust owns the aircraft with the LLC as the beneficiary. Now, as I mentioned, I did mention the voting trust briefly. That is another option. It's a little more complex, but in certain scenarios, in that situation, the trust would actually own the membership of the LLC to qualify it to be a citizen. So if you had a scenario where the membership of the LLC would be a non-citizen, you can put that LLC membership in a voting trust, what they call voting trust, to qualify that entity as a citizen. So that entity would still be the registered owner, but the trust is used to qualify that entity as a citizen. So there's kind of the owner trust is a little easier and less complex and more commonly used, but that voting trust is a possibility and is used for entities that might want it registered for various reasons, want it registered in their own name, but have a ownership issue, so it can solve it on either side.
Gavin, if that answered all of your questions, or if you have any more, send them through. Otherwise, we're getting ready to terminate this webinar. So quickly at the last minute, quick, type. David, it appears you've filled everybody's bucket with today's knowledge. Thank you for the professional manner in which you handled this. And we're going to end this event in the next 10 seconds unless a question comes through.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everybody participating. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, 10 seconds are up, so you can't ask any more questions. You can still send them to me, or you can send them directly to Dave, because you obviously remembered to use your phone and take a picture, so you have his phone number and his email address in your files for the rest of your life. All right. Thank you again for everybody attending this morning. Shay promises me this video will be up on our website very soon. She got mad at me the last time I told her that it was going to happen today, so I'm not allowed to make any commitments that any kind of electrical storm here in Sacramento area will stop. So, all right. Thank you, and we're signing off.